Hashtag the hook that changes everything. The gymnasium fell silent as she walked across the stage. Every eye was fixed on the small bronze star pinned to her chest, a medal that had become the source of whispers, cruel jokes, and endless doubt. They called it a participation trophy. They said she didn't deserve it. Some even suggested she had lied about her service. But what happened next would shatter every assumption, silence every critic, and reveal a truth so powerful that grown soldiers would weep openly. Because sometimes, the smallest medals carry the heaviest stories. And sometimes, the person you underestimate the most is the one who has sacrificed everything. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman whose bronze star became a symbol of controversy until the day her true story was finally told. A story that would transform mockery into respect, doubt into admiration, and prove that heroism often comes in the most unexpected forms. Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting the small bronze star on her dress uniform one final time. The medal felt heavier than its actual weight, carrying with it months of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Today was the annual Veterans Day ceremony at Riverside Community College, where she worked as a counselor. As one of the few female veterans on staff, she had been asked to speak about her service. The Bronze Star medal gleamed under the harsh bathroom lights, its five-pointed star catching the reflection. Most people who saw it assumed it was awarded for something simple, maybe administrative work or just being present during deployment. After all, Sarah was barely 5 feet tall, soft-spoken, and worked quietly in the college counseling center. She didn't fit the image most people had of a combat veteran. Walking through the campus corridors toward the auditorium, Sarah passed clusters of students and faculty. She caught fragments of conversations that made her stomach tighten. "I heard she got that medal for filing papers in an air-conditioned office," whispered Jake Thompson, a young political science student who often bragged about his plans to join the military after graduation. "My brother's a Marine and he says they give those things out like candy now," added his friend Marcus. "Especially to women. You know, for diversity." Professor Williams, who taught military history, was holding court near the coffee machine. "The standards have really dropped," he was saying to a small group. "In my father's day, you had to do something truly heroic to earn a Bronze Star. Now they hand them out for showing up." Sarah kept walking, her face burning with familiar shame and frustration. She had stopped trying to correct these misconceptions months ago. Every time she attempted to explain, people either didn't believe her or made her feel like she was making excuses. It was easier to stay quiet and let them think whatever they wanted. The auditorium was filling up as Sarah entered through the side door. Veterans from different eras sat in the front rows, elderly men from Korea and Vietnam, middle-aged veterans from the Gulf War and early Iraq deployments, and younger men and women from the more recent conflicts. She noticed how the older veterans nodded respectfully to each other, recognizing shared experiences in each other's eyes. But when they looked at her, she saw only polite confusion. "Sarah," called out Tom Rodriguez, the college's veteran affairs coordinator and a former army sergeant. He had lost his left leg to an IED in Afghanistan and walked with a prosthetic. "Ready for your speech?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom had been one of the few people who never questioned her medal or her service. He had his own struggles with PTSD and understood that war affected everyone differently. But even his support couldn't shield her from the constant doubt of others. Colonel Harrison, retired Army and now the college's ROTC instructor, approached them. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a chest full of decorations from his 30-year career. His eyes swept over Sarah's uniform with barely concealed skepticism. "Mitchell," he said in his parade ground voice, "I see you're wearing the Bronze Star. Might I ask what unit you served with?" This question had become Sarah's nightmare. Every time someone with military experience met her, it was the first thing they asked. Not about her service in general, not about her experience as a veteran, but specifically about her medal. "I was with the 230th Transportation Company," she answered quietly. Colonel Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Transportation units were often seen as rear echelon support, far from combat. In his mind, this confirmed his suspicions about her medal. "Support unit," he said, making it sound like an accusation. Those Bronze Stars they were giving out to support personnel toward the end of Iraq, well, times were different then. Sarah felt the familiar burning in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever someone dismissed her service. She wanted to scream, to tell him exactly what she had done, what she had sacrificed, what she had seen. But the words never came. They stuck in her throat like shards of glass, cutting her from the inside. "Excuse me," she managed, and walked quickly toward the backstage area. In the small preparation room behind the auditorium, Sarah sat alone on a folding chair, trying to steady her breathing. Through the thin walls, she could hear the murmur of the growing crowd. Soon, she would have to stand in front of all those people and talk about service, sacrifice, and honor. But how could she speak about honor when everyone questioned whether she deserved to wear her own medal? The door opened, and Dr. Spiff, Patricia Hayes, the college president, walked in. Dr. Hayes was a woman in her 60s who had broken many barriers in academic administration. She took one look at Sarah's face and closed the door behind her. "What's wrong, dear?" Dr. Hayes asked, her voice full of maternal concern. Sarah shook her head, not trusting herself to speak without crying. "Is it about your medal again?" Dr. Hayes pressed gently. She had witnessed some of the whispered comments around campus and had tried to address them when possible. "They think I don't deserve it," Sarah finally said. "They think it's some kind of participation trophy because I'm small and quiet and I work in counseling. They think all I did was push papers in some air-conditioned office." "Doctor." Hayes sat down in the chair next to Sarah. "You know what you did over there. You know what you sacrificed. That's what matters." "But nobody believes me," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "Even when I try to explain, they look at me like I'm making it up or exaggerating. Colonel Harrison just basically called my medal a handout." The older woman was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you've never told anyone the full story, have you?" "Not even Tom Rodriguez knows exactly what happened." Sarah shook her head. "I can't. Every time I start to talk about it, I can't. The nightmares are still bad?" "Dr. Grace," Hayes asked gently. "Every night," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I wake up and I can still smell the smoke, still hear the screaming. I see their faces, Rodriguez and Martinez and Williams. I see them in my dreams, and they're always asking me why I couldn't save them." "Doctor," Hayes reached over and took Sarah's hand. "Sweetheart, you saved 19 people that day. 19 soldiers who went home to their families because of what you did." "But I couldn't save them all," Sarah whispered. "I couldn't save my friends." The sound of applause from the auditorium interrupted their conversation. The ceremony was beginning. In a few minutes, Sarah would be introduced, and she would have to stand up there and pretend that everything was fine, that she was proud of her service, that her medal meant something to her besides pain and loss. "I have an idea," Dr. Hayes said suddenly. "What if, instead of giving a generic speech about veterans, you told your story, your real story?" Sarah's eyes widened with panic. "I can't. I've never talked about it publicly. I don't even talk about it in therapy most of the time." "Maybe it's time, Dr. Hayes said softly. "Maybe it's time to let people know what really happened. Not for them, but for you. You've been carrying this alone for too long." Through the walls, they could hear Colonel Harrison's voice as he introduced the first speaker. His words carried the same tone of respectful authority that had intimidated Sarah earlier. "I can't," Sarah repeated, but there was something different in her voice now, a tiny crack in her armor of fear. "You don't have to decide right now, Doctor," Hayes said. "Just think about it. Think about those 19 families who still have their loved ones because of you. Think about Rodriguez and Martinez and Williams, and what they would want you to do." Sarah closed her eyes, and for a moment she could see them clearly, not as the broken bodies from her nightmares, but as they were in life. Rodriguez with his constant jokes and his pictures of his little daughter. Martinez always sharing homemade cookies from care packages. Williams, barely 19, who talked endlessly about his plans for college. They'd been her friends, her team, her responsibility. And when everything went wrong that terrible day in Iraq, she had tried to save them all. The fact that she couldn't still haunted her, but maybe Dr. Hayes was right. Maybe it was time to honor them by telling the truth. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Mitchell?" "You're up in 5 minutes," came a voice from outside. Sarah stood up slowly, smoothing down her uniform. The bronze star caught the light again, and for just a moment, instead of shame, she felt something else. Not pride, exactly, but a kind of recognition. This medal wasn't about her. It never had been. It was about Rodriguez and Martinez and Williams. It was about the 19 soldiers who made it home. It was about a convoy that went wrong and a young woman who did everything she could when everything fell apart. "I'll think about it," she told Dr. Jan Hayes. "About telling the real story. That's all I ask," the older woman replied. "But Sarah, remember this. You are not responsible for their deaths. You did everything humanly possible. Sometimes, courage isn't about being fearless. Sometimes, it's about being afraid and doing what's right anyway. As Sarah walked toward the stage entrance, she could hear polite applause for the current speaker. In a few moments, she would be standing in front of a crowd that had already judged her, already decided that she was something less than a real veteran. She could give the safe speech she had prepared, full of generic platitudes about service and sacrifice. Or, she could do something terrifying. She could tell them the truth. Standing in the wings of the stage, Sarah touched her bronze star one more time. Behind the metal, she could feel the steady beating of her heart, the same heart that had kept beating through the worst day of her life, the same heart that had pumped blood through her body as she ran through fire and smoke, trying desperately to save her friends. Maybe it was time to let that heart speak. Sarah walked onto the stage to scattered, polite applause. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and community members, all expecting a typical Veterans Day speech about duty and honor. She approached the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edges. The prepared speech lay folded in her pocket, but suddenly it felt like a lie she couldn't tell anymore. Looking out at the crowd, she saw Colonel Harrison in the front row, his arms crossed, waiting for her to confirm his low expectations. Jake Thompson and Marcus sat in the middle section, whispering to each other. Professor Williams checked his phone, clearly uninterested in what the quiet counselor with the questionable medal might have to say. Sarah cleared her throat and began speaking, her voice barely carrying to the back of the room. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I served in Iraq with the 230th Transportation Company. She paused, seeing the knowing looks exchanged between some of the veterans. Transportation meant supply runs, mail delivery, routine convoys far from real danger. I was awarded the Bronze Star Medal on March 15, 2007, she continued, her voice growing slightly stronger. And for the past 3 years, people have questioned whether I deserved it. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't the direction anyone expected her speech to go. I've stayed quiet about what happened that day because talking about it brings back memories I've spent years trying to forget. But maybe it's time you knew the truth about what supply soldiers really face in war. Colonel Harrison straightened in his seat. Something in Sarah's voice had changed, a gravity that commanded attention. It was March 10, 2007. We were running a routine convoy from Camp Victory to a forward operating base about 40 miles north of Baghdad. I was the convoy commander for 6 trucks carrying medical supplies, ammunition, and mail. Routine mission. We'd done it dozens of times. Sarah's hand stopped trembling as she found her footing in the story she had never told publicly. My team consisted of 24 soldiers, mostly kids between 18 and 25. Private Rodriguez was our youngest at 18, barely old enough to vote. He carried pictures of his baby daughter everywhere and talked about teaching her to ride a bike when he got home. Specialist Martinez was our medic, always taking care of everyone else before himself. Sergeant Williams was our communications expert, planning to use his military training to become an electrical engineer. The auditorium had grown completely quiet. Even Jake Thompson had stopped whispering. The IED that hit our lead vehicle wasn't unusual by Iraq standards. A buried artillery shell rigged with a cell phone trigger. What made that day different was everything that happened after the explosion. Sarah paused, her breathing becoming more deliberate. In her mind, she was back in the desert, tasting dust and smoke. The blast flipped our lead truck and started a fire that spread to the ammunition we were carrying. Within minutes, we had wounded soldiers, burning vehicles, and incoming small arms fire from insurgents who had been waiting for us. This was their kill zone, carefully planned and perfectly executed. Colonel Harrison leaned forward, his skeptical expression replaced by focused attention. As convoy commander, my job was to establish a defensive perimeter and call for backup. Standard procedure. But when I saw Rodriguez trapped under the overturned vehicle with both legs crushed, when I heard Martinez screaming for help as he tried to treat 3 wounded soldiers with 1 field kit, when Williams couldn't reach headquarters because our communications equipment was destroyed in the blast, standard procedure went out the window. Sarah's voice was steady now, carrying clearly to every corner of the auditorium. I made a decision that every officer is trained never to make. I left the safety of my position and went back for my soldiers. Not once, but 6 times. Dr. Hayes, who was standing near the stage entrance, wiped tears from her eyes. This was the first time she had heard the complete story. The first trip was for Rodriguez. He was pinned under 2 tons of twisted metal, conscious and begging me not to leave him. It took me and 2 other soldiers 15 minutes to lift enough wreckage to pull him out. By then, the ammunition in our burning vehicles was starting to cook off, sending bullets and shrapnel in every direction. The audience was completely silent now. Even the students who had been checking their phones were staring at Sarah with new understanding. The second trip was for Martinez and the wounded. He had been trying to treat multiple casualties in the open when insurgent fire increased. I had to half-carry, half-drag him to cover while he held pressure on another soldier's arterial bleeding. That soldier lived because Martinez refused to leave him. Sarah's voice caught slightly, but she pushed forward. The third trip was the hardest. Sergeant Williams had gone back into the burning lead vehicle to try to recover our radio equipment. When I found him, the truck was fully engulfed in flames and ammunition was exploding all around us. He was unconscious from smoke inhalation, and I had maybe 30 seconds before the fire reached our ammunition storage. The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Professor Williams had stopped checking his phone entirely. I couldn't lift him alone. He was 6 feet tall and outweighed me by 80 pounds. But I dragged him anyway, inch by inch, while metal fragments from exploding rounds hit the sand around us. I can still feel the heat from those flames on my back, still smell the burning fuel and melting plastic. Tears were flowing freely down Dr. Hayes' face now, and she wasn't the only one crying. By the time I got Williams to safety, reinforcements had arrived. The firefight was under control, the wounded were being evacuated, and my job was done. Standard operating procedure said I had performed adequately as a convoy commander under enemy fire. Sarah looked directly at Colonel Harrison as she continued. But I wasn't done. There were still 3 soldiers unaccounted for in the chaos. Army policy said to wait for specialized rescue teams. But those teams were 30 minutes away, and our burning vehicles wouldn't wait 30 minutes. Colonel Harrison's mouth had fallen open slightly. He was beginning to understand what kind of story he was hearing. Trip 4 was for Private Johnson, who had been thrown clear of the explosion but was unconscious in an irrigation ditch 50 yards from our perimeter. I crawled to his position while insurgent snipers took shots at anything that moved. Johnson had a concussion and couldn't walk, so I carried him on my back across open ground while bullets kicked up sand around us. Sarah's voice was strong now, almost matter-of-fact, as if she was describing someone else's actions. Trip 5 was for Corporals Anderson and Thompson, who had taken cover in a bombed-out building but were cut off from our defensive line by crossfire. I used smoke grenades to create cover and went in after them. Anderson had taken shrapnel to his chest, and Thompson was in shock. I had to convince them to leave their secure position and follow me back through enemy fire to reach our evacuation point. The auditorium was completely still. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. The 6th trip was the one that almost killed me. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone could hear her clearly. I went back for our classified equipment and important documents that couldn't fall into enemy hands. Army regulations required their destruction or recovery, and our demolition charges had been damaged in the explosion. She paused, looking down at her hands. I was in the burning command vehicle, grabbing encrypted radios and codebooks, when the vehicle's fuel tank exploded. The blast threw me 15 feet and gave me a concussion. Second-degree burns on my arms and back, and temporary hearing loss. When I woke up, the firefight was over, and medics were loading me onto a helicopter. Dr. Hayes stepped closer to the stage, her heart breaking as she watched Sarah relive the worst day of her life. All 24 members of my convoy made it home alive. Rodriguez lost part of his left leg, but learned to walk again in time to teach his daughter to ride that bike. Martinez finished his medical training and became a physician's assistant. Williams got his engineering degree, and now designs communication systems for the military. Sarah looked back up at the audience, her eyes finding Colonel Harrison's face. 3 soldiers didn't make it home. Not from my convoy, but from the rescue unit that came to help us. They died when their helicopter was shot down, during the medical evacuation. Their names were Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Specialist James Washington, and Private First Class Daniel Kim. They died saving us, and I think about them every single day. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, Colonel Harrison stood up from his chair. His face had completely changed, the skepticism replaced by something that looked like awe and regret. I was wrong, he said, his powerful voice carrying through the auditorium. I was completely wrong about you, and I owe you an apology. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. I didn't tell you this story to prove I deserved my medal, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I told you because for 3 years, I've let people believe that some medals are worth more than others, that some service matters more, that some sacrifices count for more than others. She touched the bronze star on her chest. This medal doesn't represent my heroism. It represents the heroism of 24 soldiers who trusted me to bring them home, and the sacrifice of 3 soldiers who died trying to save us. Every time someone questions whether I deserve it, they're questioning whether those soldiers' lives mattered. The entire auditorium erupted in applause, but this time it wasn't polite or scattered. It was thunderous, emotional, and full of respect that had been earned through truth. But the most powerful moment came when the applause died down, and one by one, every veteran in the audience stood up and rendered a perfect military salute to the small woman standing at the podium. Sarah Mitchell, who had spent 3 years in shame, finally saluted back. The standing ovation seemed to last forever, but for Sarah, time had stopped completely. She stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, watching as hardened veterans openly wept while maintaining their salutes. Colonel Harrison's salute was the steadiest of all, his eyes never leaving her face as he mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." When the applause finally died down and the veterans took their seats, Sarah realized something fundamental had changed. Not just in the room, but inside herself. For the first time in 3 years, the weight of her Bronze Star felt like an honor rather than a burden. Dr. Wall, Hayes approached the podium as Sarah stepped away, but before she could speak, Jake Thompson stood up from his seat in the middle of the auditorium. His face was red with emotion and shame. "Ms. Mitchell," he called out, his voice cracking. "I owe you an apology. I said terrible things about you and your service. I was ignorant and disrespectful, and I'm sorry." Other voices joined his from around the auditorium. Marcus, Jake's friend, stood up next. "I'm sorry too. We didn't understand what we were talking about." Professor Williams rose from his seat, his face pale with remorse. "Ms. Mitchell, I've been teaching military history for 15 years, and I thought I understood service and sacrifice. You've taught me more in 20 minutes than I've learned in all my years of research. I publicly apologize for my comments and my attitude." Sarah nodded acknowledgement to each apology, but she could see that something larger was happening. The story she had kept locked inside for 3 years wasn't just healing her own wounds. It was opening eyes and changing perspectives throughout the community. After the ceremony ended, Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to thank her, apologize to her, or simply shake her hand. But the most meaningful encounter came when a young woman in an army uniform approached her near the back of the auditorium. "Ms. Mitchell," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Private Lisa Chen. I ship out to Afghanistan next month with a transportation unit." Sarah shook her hand, noting the nervous energy that radiated from the young soldier. "I was scared," Private Chen admitted. "Everyone talks about transportation like it's the safe job, like we'll never see real combat. After hearing your story, I understand that there's no such thing as a safe job in a war zone. But I'm not as scared anymore, because I know that if something happens, I'll do what you did. I'll take care of my soldiers." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. "You'll do fine, Private. Just remember that bringing everyone home is the only mission that really matters." As Private Chen walked away, Colonel Harrison appeared at Sarah's side. The imposing man who had questioned her mettle just hours earlier now seemed smaller, humbled by what he had learned. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to tell you something," he began, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I served 3 tours in Iraq. I've seen combat, lost soldiers under my command, and I thought I understood what courage looked like. But what you did that day, 6 trips back into a kill zone for your soldiers, that's something I'm not sure I could have done." Sarah looked up at the decorated colonel. "You would have done the same thing, sir. Any good leader would have." Colonel Harrison shook his head. "No, Sarah. Most leaders would have followed protocol. They would have waited for backup, established a perimeter, and tried to minimize casualties. What you did went beyond leadership into something else entirely. You risked everything because you couldn't bear the thought of losing even one of your soldiers." He paused, looking down at his hands. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you my respect and my gratitude for reminding me what service really means. Would you allow me to recommend you for speaking engagements at other military events? There are a lot of people who need to hear your story." Before Sarah could answer, Tom Rodriguez approached on his prosthetic leg. His eyes were still red from crying during her speech. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. "All these months I've watched you struggle with people questioning your service, and you never said a word about what really happened." Sarah struggled to find the right words. "I couldn't, Tom. Every time I thought about that day, all I could see were the faces of the soldiers who didn't make it home. Torres, Washington, Kim. They died because of our convoy, because of my decisions. How could I talk about being a hero when they were the ones who paid the ultimate price?" Tom placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, those men died doing their job, saving wounded soldiers. That's what they trained for, what they volunteered for. You didn't cause their deaths any more than you caused the IED that started everything, but you saved 24 lives. 24 families still have their loved ones because of what you did. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of an elderly woman using a walker. She moved slowly but with determination, and Sarah noticed she was wearing a small gold star pin, the symbol of a mother who had lost a child in military service. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice wavering with age and emotion. "Are you the young lady who spoke about the convoy?" Sarah nodded, wondering what this woman might want to say to her. "My son was killed in Iraq in 2008, the woman continued. He was in a transportation unit too. For years, people have told me that he wasn't a real soldier, because he wasn't infantry, that he was just a truck driver who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Tears began flowing down the woman's face, but her voice remained strong. "Thank you for telling the truth about what our children faced over there. My son Danny was a hero, just like you, just like all the soldiers who served in those convoys. You've given me something I've needed for years, validation that his service and his sacrifice mattered." Sarah found herself crying again as she embraced the Gold Star mother. In that moment, she realized that her story wasn't just about one convoy or one day in Iraq. It was about every soldier who had been dismissed as just support, every veteran whose service had been minimized because it didn't fit someone's narrow definition of heroism. Word of Sarah's speech began spreading beyond the college community. By evening, local news stations were calling Dr. Hayes' office asking for interviews. By the next morning, the story had been picked up by military blogs and veteran support websites. The video of her speech, recorded by the college's media department, was shared thousands of times across social media. But the most significant impact was happening in places Sarah never expected. At Fort Benning, drill sergeants were using excerpts from her speech to teach new recruits about leadership under fire. At the Pentagon, her story became part of a briefing about the changing nature of combat in asymmetric warfare. At VA hospitals across the country, counselors were sharing her words with veterans struggling with their own doubts about their service. 3 days after the speech, Sarah received a phone call that would change her life again. The caller identified himself as General Patricia Adams, the highest-ranking woman in the Army. "Miss Mitchell," the general said, "I've seen the video of your speech, and I've read the after-action reports from your convoy incident. I have a proposition for you." Sarah listened as the general explained that the Army was developing a new program to support veterans transitioning to civilian life, with a special focus on those suffering from PTSD and survivor's guilt. "We need someone to head up the program," General Adams continued. "Someone who understands what our soldiers have been through, someone who can speak their language and help them find their way forward. Your background in counseling, combined with your military experience and your obvious ability to inspire people, makes you the perfect candidate." The offer was tempting, but Sarah had concerns. "General, I'm honored, but I still struggle with my own issues. I have nightmares, panic attacks, days when I can barely function. How can I help other veterans when I haven't fully healed myself?" General Adams laughed quietly. "Miss Mitchell, the fact that you're still fighting your own battles is exactly why you're the right person for this job. Our veterans don't need someone who has all the answers. They need someone who understands their struggle and can show them that healing is possible, even if it's not perfect." As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about Private Chen, about the Gold Star mother, about all the veterans who had saluted her after her speech. She thought about Rodriguez, Martinez, and Williams, and what they would want her to do with the second chance she had been given. She thought about Torres Washington and Kim, the 3 soldiers who had died saving her convoy. What would they want their sacrifice to mean? "I'll take the position," Sarah told the general, "but I have one condition. I want to establish a memorial fund for the families of soldiers killed in non-combat operations. Transportation, medical, communications, all the support roles that don't get recognition when soldiers die." "Done," General Adams replied without hesitation. "Welcome back to the Army, Colonel Mitchell." Sarah nearly dropped the phone. "Colonel, your promotion comes with the position. Your actions in Iraq warranted the rank years ago. It just took us too long to recognize it." As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked at her reflection in her office window. The same bronze star was pinned to her shirt, but everything else had changed. She was no longer the ashamed, quietly suffering veteran she had been that morning. She was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, and she had work to do. The ripples from one honest speech were spreading farther than she could have imagined, touching lives and changing perceptions across the military community. But the most important change was the one happening inside her own heart. For the first time since March 10, 2007, Sarah Mitchell was proud to be a soldier. 6 months after accepting her new position, Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood in the conference room at the Pentagon, addressing a group of military leaders, congressional representatives, and veteran advocacy groups. The Veteran Transition and Support Program she now directed had already helped over 300 veterans find their footing in civilian life. But today's meeting was about something even more important. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence that had grown since that day at Riverside Community College. "We're here to discuss the Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund, which will provide support for the families of service members who died in what the military classifies as non-combat operations." Congressman Bradley, a former Marine who had lost friends in Iraq, leaned forward in his chair. "Colonel Mitchell, can you explain why this distinction matters? A death in service is a death in service, isn't it?" Sarah had expected this question. It went to the heart of the problem she had experienced personally for years. "Sir, when a soldier dies in direct combat with the enemy, their family receives specific honors and benefits. Their death is recognized as heroic, their sacrifice is celebrated, and their children grow up knowing their parent died as a warrior. But when soldiers die in transportation accidents, training exercises, equipment failures, or while supporting combat operations, their deaths are often treated as secondary tragedies." She clicked to her next slide, showing photographs of 3 young men in Army uniforms. These are the faces of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Specialist James Washington, and Private First Class Daniel Kim. They died when their medical evacuation helicopter was shot down while rescuing wounded soldiers from my convoy in Iraq. Their deaths were classified as non-combat casualties because they weren't killed in direct firefight with insurgents. They were killed while trying to save lives. The room had grown very quiet. Several of the military leaders present had dealt with similar classification issues in their own careers. Torres left behind a wife and 2 young sons. Washington was sending money home to support his disabled mother. Kim was 3 weeks away from finishing his deployment and returning home to marry his high school sweetheart. Their families received the standard benefits, but they were never invited to Gold Star family events, never recognized at military ceremonies, never given the honor their sacrifice deserved. General Patricia Adams, who had become one of Sarah's strongest supporters, nodded approvingly as Sarah continued. "The Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund will provide educational scholarships, counseling services, and financial support for these forgotten families. More importantly, it will ensure that their loved ones' sacrifices are recognized and honored appropriately." As Sarah outlined the program's details, she noticed a young woman in Navy uniform taking careful notes in the back of the room. During the break, the woman approached her. "Colonel Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Commander Jennifer Walsh. I wanted to thank you for what you're doing with this fund." Sarah shook her hand, noting the sadness in the young officer's eyes. "My brother was killed in Afghanistan 2 years ago," Lieutenant Commander Walsh continued. "He was a Navy corpsman attached to a Marine unit. He died when the field hospital he was working in was hit by a rocket attack. Because he wasn't technically in combat when he died, his death was classified as non-combat." Sarah felt the familiar pain in her chest. Even now, these stories affected her deeply. "My family has struggled with that classification ever since. It makes it feel like David's death somehow mattered less than if he had been killed while treating wounded Marines in the field instead of treating them in the hospital. Your fund gives us hope that someday his sacrifice will be properly recognized." These conversations had become routine for Sarah since taking her new position. Every week she met families who had been dealing with the bureaucratic complexities and emotional difficulties of losing a loved one in non-combat circumstances. Each story reinforced her belief that the fund was necessary and important. Later that day, Sarah returned to her office to find Rodriguez waiting for her. Not Sergeant Rodriguez from her convoy, but Maria Rodriguez, Private Rodriguez's daughter, the baby whose pictures he had carried everywhere during his deployment. She was now 4 years old, a bright little girl with her father's infectious smile. "Aunt Sarah," Maria called out, running to embrace her. Sarah had maintained close relationships with the families of her convoy members, becoming an unofficial aunt to many of their children. "Hello, sweetheart," Sarah said, lifting Maria into a hug. "What brings you and Daddy to Washington?" Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had indeed learned to walk again on his prosthetic leg, appeared in the doorway. He was now working as a military recruiter, sharing his positive attitude and dedication with young people considering military service. "We wanted to see your new office," Rodriguez explained. "And Maria wanted to give you something." The little girl handed Sarah a carefully drawn picture showing stick figures in military uniforms. At the bottom, in careful 4-year-old handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Aunt Sarah, for bringing Daddy home."
Sarah felt tears building in her eyes as she examined the drawing.
In Maria's innocent artwork, She saw something she had struggled to see for years: the positive impact of her actions on that terrible day in Iraq. "This is going on my wall right here," Sarah told Maria, pointing to the space behind her desk. "Every time I have a bad day, I'll look at your picture and remember why I do this work." As Rodriguez prepared to leave with his daughter, he turned back to Sarah with a serious expression. "Sarah, there's something I need to tell you. I've been talking to some of the other guys from our convoy, and we've all agreed on something. We want to do whatever we can to support your memorial fund." Sarah looked puzzled. "That's generous, Rodriguez, but you don't need to." "Yes, we do," he interrupted. "You saved our lives that day, and then you spent 3 years torturing yourself because you couldn't save everyone. You've given us a chance to give something back, to honor the guys who died saving us. We're going to set up a fundraising organization for military families, run by veterans who understand what these families are going through." The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. Who better to support grieving military families than the soldiers whose lives had been saved by others' sacrifices? Over the following weeks, Sarah watched as her former convoy members organized themselves into a formidable support network. Martinez, now a physician's assistant, provided medical consultations for family members struggling with health issues. Williams, the engineer, helped military families navigate the complex benefits system. Rodriguez coordinated outreach efforts, using his recruiting connections to spread awareness about the fund. But the most meaningful development came when Sarah received a call from an unexpected source. Mrs. Torres, the widow of the staff sergeant who had died in the helicopter crash. "Colonel Mitchell," Mrs. Torres said, her voice carrying a strength that Sarah hadn't expected. "I want to volunteer for your memorial fund." Sarah was stunned. Mrs. debaned. "Torres, you don't need to do that. This fund is supposed to help you and families like yours." "That's exactly why I want to help," Mrs. Torres replied. "My husband died trying to save wounded soldiers. The best way I can honor his memory is by helping other families who are going through what we went through." Mrs. Torres had taken her husband's life insurance money and started a small business, which was now successful enough for her to give both time and resources to the memorial fund. Her 2 sons, now teenagers, had decided to pursue military careers in honor of their father's legacy. "Michael always said that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform," Mrs. Torres continued. "He would want me to continue serving in whatever way I can." As Sarah hung up the phone, she realized that something beautiful was emerging from the tragedy of March 10, 2007. The convoy that had been attacked, the soldiers who had been saved, and the rescuers who had died were all becoming part of a larger story about service, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect military families. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood before another audience, this time at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund had received its official charter from Congress, and media from across the country had come to cover the announcement. "6 months ago, I was a college counselor who was ashamed of her military service," Sarah began, her voice steady and confident. "I wore my Bronze Star like a burden instead of an honor, because I believed the voices that told me my service didn't matter, that my sacrifice wasn't real, that my soldiers' lives weren't worth saving." The press conference was being broadcast live on military television networks and veteran support websites. In living rooms, Virginia hospitals, and military bases around the world, veterans were watching Sarah's words with recognition and hope. "Today, I stand before you as the director of a program that has already helped hundreds of veterans find their way home from war, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. I'm here to announce that we're expanding that mission to include the families of the hidden heroes who died serving their country in ways that don't always make headlines." As she spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed with text messages from convoy members, their families, and veterans around the country who were watching the broadcast. Each message contained variations of the same sentiment: pride, gratitude, and recognition that their service mattered. The Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund will ensure that every military death is honored appropriately, regardless of the circumstances. Because there are no small sacrifices in service to this country, and there are no forgotten heroes in the military. The applause from the press conference audience was respectful and appropriate. But Sarah knew the real response was happening in military communities around the world, where veterans and military families were finally seeing their experiences validated and honored.
After the press conference, General Adams approached Sarah with a smile.
"Colonel, I have some news that I think you'll appreciate. The Army Chief of Staff has approved a new policy change regarding combat classifications. Deaths that occur during support operations in hostile environments will now be considered combat-related for the purposes of family benefits and honors." Sarah felt her knees weaken. This was the change she had hoped for but never expected to see implemented so quickly. General, this means that families like Torres, Washingtons, and Kims will finally get the recognition they deserve?
Exactly, General Adams confirmed.
Your advocacy made the difference, Sarah. You turned your pain into purpose, and it's changed how the military honors service and sacrifice. As Sarah returned to her office that evening, she found Maria Rodriguez's drawing still taped to her wall. Looking at it now, she saw something different than the simple thank you note she had initially perceived. She saw the future, a generation of military children who would grow up understanding that every form of service matters, that every sacrifice has value, and that heroes come in many different forms. The little girl who had drawn stick figures of soldiers had captured something profound about the military experience that Sarah was only now beginning to understand. In Maria's innocent perspective, there were no second-class veterans, no questionable medals, no hierarchy of heroism. There were only people who served and people who came home safely because others had served. It was a lesson that Sarah wished she had learned 3 years earlier, but she was grateful to understand it now. 2 years after the Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund was established, Sarah stood in Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp autumn morning, watching as families gathered around 3 new headstones. The graves of Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Specialist James Washington, and Private First Class Daniel Kim had finally been moved to the hallowed ground they deserved, and their families were attending the dedication ceremony that had been years in the making. Mrs. Torres approached Sarah, her 2 teenage sons flanking her on either side. Both boys were now in ROTC programs, following in their father's footsteps. "Colonel Mitchell," Mrs. Torres said, embracing Sarah warmly. "Michael would be so proud to see what's grown from his sacrifice." Sarah looked at the 3 headstones, each now bearing the proper military honors and recognition that had been denied to them for so long. The sight filled her with a complex mixture of satisfaction and lingering sadness. They were heroes from the beginning, Mrs. Torres. It just took the Army too long to acknowledge it officially. Michael Jr., Mrs. Torres's oldest son, stepped forward. At 17, he bore a striking resemblance to his father, with the same determined expression and kind eyes that Sarah remembered from the old photographs Rodriguez used to carry. "Colonel Mitchell, I want you to know that I'm going to the same military academy my father attended. When I graduate and become an officer, I want to serve in a transportation unit, just like he did. I want to show people that support soldiers are real soldiers too." The words hit Sarah with unexpected force. Here was a young man whose father had died saving her convoy, choosing to follow the same path that had led to his father's death. But he wasn't doing it despite his father's sacrifice. He was doing it because of it. "Your father would be honored by that choice," Sarah told him. "But make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Military service should be about serving something bigger than yourself, not proving something to other people." "I understand," Michael Jr. replied. "But after watching what you've accomplished with the Memorial Fund, after seeing how you've changed how people think about military services, I want to be part of that change too." As the dedication ceremony continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by her work over the past 2 years. Colonel Harrison, who had become one of her strongest allies, was there with a group of ROTC cadets from his program. Dr. Hayes had flown in from California with several Riverside Community College faculty members, including Professor Williams, who now taught a course on the changing nature of military service in modern warfare. Most meaningful to Sarah were the convoy veterans who had traveled from across the country to attend the ceremony. Rodriguez was there with Maria, now 6 years old, and still drawing pictures for Aunt Sarah. Martinez had brought his wife and newborn son, whom they had named Michael, in honor of Staff Sergeant Torres. Williams attended with his fiancée, a nurse he had met while volunteering at a VA hospital. But the most unexpected attendee was Private Lisa Chen, the young soldier who had approached Sarah after her speech at Riverside Community College. Chen was now Sergeant Chen, having completed 2 deployments with the transportation unit in Afghanistan. She had requested leave specifically to attend the ceremony. "Colonel Mitchell," Sergeant Chen said, saluting smartly, "I wanted to thank you again for preparing me for what I would face in Afghanistan." Sarah returned the salute and gestured for Chen to relax. "How did your deployments go, Sergeant?" "Challenging," Chen replied honestly. "We took casualties, lost some good soldiers, and I had to make some of the same kinds of decisions you made in Iraq. But because of your example, I knew what kind of leader I wanted to be. I brought my soldiers home." Chen's words reminded Sarah of why her work mattered. Every veteran who found the strength to lead with courage, every family that received proper recognition for their sacrifice, Every young soldier who understood that all military service was honorable, these were the victories that made her struggles worthwhile. As the official ceremony concluded, a small group gathered around the 3 headstones for a more personal moment. Sarah stood with the families of Torres, Washington, and Kim, along with the survivors from her convoy. For the first time since March 10, 2007, all of these people were together in one place. Rodriguez stepped forward, his prosthetic leg steady beneath him, and began to speak. 15 years ago, these 3 men died saving our lives. For too many years, their sacrifice wasn't properly recognized or honored. But because of Colonel Mitchell's courage in telling our story, because of her refusal to let their deaths be forgotten or minimized, they're finally receiving the honor they deserve from the beginning.
He turned to look at Sarah directly.
But I want to say something else. Sarah, you've spent 15 years carrying guilt about the soldiers you couldn't save that day. You've tormented yourself about Torres, Washington, and Kim, as if their deaths were somehow your fault. It's time for that to end. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion as Rodriguez continued. These men didn't die because of your decisions. They died because they were heroes who volunteered to risk their lives to save wounded soldiers. That's what heroes do. They don't calculate odds or worry about their own safety when other people need help. And because they were heroes, 24 families got to keep their loved ones. Washington, the mother of Specialist Washington, stepped forward. She was an elderly African-American woman who had raised her son alone after his father died when James was young. Colonel Mitchell, she said, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her through years of grief. My son James always wanted to be a medic because he wanted to save lives. The day he died, he was doing exactly what he had trained for, what he believed in. You didn't cause his death. You gave his death meaning by making sure the soldiers he died trying to save actually survived. Mrs. Kim, a small Korean-American woman who had immigrated to the United States as a young bride, approached Sarah with tears in her eyes.
My Daniel was so young when he died, just 20 years old.
For years, I wondered if his death meant anything, if anyone would remember him or care about his sacrifice. Because of your work, because of this memorial fund, I know that his death wasn't in vain. Other families are being helped because of what happened to Daniel. Standing there surrounded by the families of the fallen and the soldiers she had saved, Sarah finally felt something she hadn't experienced since March 10, 2007 to peace. Not the absence of pain or grief, but the presence of understanding and acceptance. The nightmares would probably never completely stop. The survivor's guilt would likely always be part of her emotional landscape. But for the first time, these burdens felt manageable, purposeful even. They were reminders of the weight of command, the responsibility of leadership, and the cost of freedom that military families paid every day. As the gathering began to disperse, General Adams approached Sarah with a folder in her hand. Colonel Mitchell, I have something for you, the general said, handing Sarah the folder. It's a recommendation for promotion to Brigadier General. You've earned it through your work with the Veteran Transition Program and the Memorial Fund. Sarah opened the folder and stared at the paperwork that would make her one of the youngest female generals in Army history. The promotion represented recognition not just of her administrative abilities, but of her leadership, her advocacy, and her impact on military culture. General, I'm honored, but I need to think about this, Sarah said. My work with veterans is just getting started. There are still so many soldiers who need help transitioning to civilian life, still so many families who need support.
General Adams smiled.
Sarah, who do you think is going to continue expanding these programs if you don't accept the promotion? The Army needs leaders who understand what our soldiers face, who can advocate for their needs at the highest levels of command. You can do more as a general than you ever could as a colonel. As Sarah considered the offer, she thought about the young soldiers like Private Chen who are currently serving in harm's way, about the families like the Torres, Washington, and Kim families who deserved proper recognition for their sacrifices, and about the veterans struggling with their own demons in VA hospitals and counseling centers across the country. She thought about Rodriguez's daughter Maria, now old enough to understand that her father was a hero, and about Michael Torres Jr., preparing to follow his father's path into military service. She thought about all the future soldiers who would benefit from the program she had built and the policies she had changed. I'll accept the promotion, Sarah told General Adams, but I want to continue my direct involvement in veteran support programs. The Pentagon needs leaders who remember what it's like to be afraid, what it's like to make impossible decisions under fire, what it's like to lose soldiers under your command. Agreed, General Adams replied. The Army needs more leaders who understand that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite fear. Later that evening, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, looking at a framed photograph she carried with her everywhere. It showed her convoy team on a rare good day in Iraq, all 24 soldiers smiling and relaxing during a break between missions. Rodriguez was making faces at the camera, Martinez was sharing cookies from a care package, and Williams was showing off a letter from his girlfriend. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, were three small figures in the background: Torres, Washington, and Kim, loading medical supplies onto their helicopter before what would be their final mission. For 15 years, Sarah had looked at this photograph and seen only tragedy and loss. Tonight, for the first time, she saw something different. She saw young people who had chosen to serve their country, who had faced danger with courage, and who had made the ultimate sacrifice to save others. She saw heroes. Tomorrow, she would return to Washington and continue her work as Brigadier General Sarah Mitchell, advocating for veterans and military families at the highest levels of government. She would expand the Hidden Heroes Memorial Fund, develop new programs for veteran mental health support, and ensure that no soldier's sacrifice was ever forgotten or minimized again. But tonight, she simply sat quietly and honored the memory of three young men whose deaths had haunted her for 15 years, and whose sacrifice had ultimately inspired her to transform pain into purpose, guilt into advocacy, and shame into strength. As Sarah prepared for bed, she touched the Bronze Star medal that still sat on her dresser. Tomorrow she would wear it again, but not as a burden or a source of shame. She would wear it as a reminder of the 24 soldiers she had brought home, the three heroes who had died saving them, and the countless veterans and military families whose lives had been improved by the programs that grew from that terrible, heroic day in Iraq. The medal had finally become what it was always meant to be, not a symbol of personal glory, but a testament to the courage, sacrifice, and unbreakable bonds that define military service. Sarah Mitchell, the small woman who had been mocked for her medal, had transformed it into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. She had turned personal trauma into national change, individual pain into collective healing, and one Bronze Star into a legacy that would honor military service for generations to come. The soldiers who had stood at attention in that college auditorium 5 years earlier had been saluting not just her courage on one day in Iraq, but her refusal to let that day define her as a victim rather than a victor. They had been saluting a true hero, not because she was fearless, but because she had found the courage to turn her fears into force for good.